They were told it was for their soul. That pain was salvation. But behind the sermons and stained glass windows, something far darker unfolded. When the church ruled not just faith, but fear, punishment took on cruel forms. From searing flesh to crushing bones, these weren't just acts of discipline, they were public theater, warnings carved into human suffering. This isn't just about religion, it's about control, obedience, and what happens when power wears a holy mask. By the 11th century, the church was more than a spiritual institution, was the most powerful structure in Europe. At its height, it rivaled monarchs, dictated law, and shaped the rhythms of daily life from birth to death. In cities and villages alike, the church was the center of time, morality, education, and governance. It claimed the authority to absolve sins, but also to determine what counted as sin in the first place. Papal bulls held more weight than royal decrees. Priests acted as judges, confessors, and enforcers. Bishops owned land, commanded armies, and taxed populations. Excommunication could ruin a king's reign. For peasants who lived under heavy feudal obligations and grinding poverty, the church's authority was absolute. Salvation or damnation depended not on kings or lords, but on the church's blessing or its wrath. This power wasn't just abstract. It manifested in courts, punishments, and public displays. Canon law governed personal behavior, marriage, sex, speech, and even thought. Defiance wasn't merely illegal, it was heretical, and heresy was treated as a threat to the social order. Punishment was often designed not only to correct, but to warn. Guilt was displayed. Suffering was ritualized. Pain was delivered in public squares under the gaze of both clergy and crowd. Fear played a central role. The church taught that eternal torment awaited the disobedient, that divine justice sanctioned earthly violence when necessary, and that visible punishment on earth was an act of mercy compared to the fires of hell. This belief system didn't just scare people, trained them to obey, to conform, and to report those who didn't. From inquisitions to confessions, from forced penance to the execution of so-called heretics, the church relied on a blend of spectacle, doctrine, and fear. Its message was clear. Suffering now could save the soul later. But refusal to obey risked everything: reputation, body, community, eternity. Across centuries, the church's grip tightened not only through preaching but through punishment. And for the lowest classes, peasants, with no power, no wealth, and no protection, this often meant that any offense, any rumor, or even a whispered doubt could lead to a public reckoning. The sacred and the brutal became indistinguishable. Faith, fear, and fire woven into one authority few dared to question. By the late Middle Ages, the sight of a man locked in a wooden frame, arms stretched, neck stiff, was common in town squares across Europe. The stocks and the pillory weren't just instruments of discipline, they were theater, designed not to inflict lethal harm but to expose, humiliate, and degrade. These punishments were sanctioned not only by local rulers but often by the church itself. The logic was clear. Public shame was seen as a form of spiritual purification. Humiliation served as a visible reckoning for hidden sin. The belief was that by suffering disgrace before man, the sinner could be cleansed before God. The pillar, typically a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, held its victims upright, forcing eye contact with every passerby. The stocks, in contrast, locked the legs and sometimes wrists, leaving the punished seated, vulnerable, and exposed. People were left in these devices for hours, even days. But the device alone wasn't the punishment the crowd was. Mockery, insults, and projectiles were expected. Rotten vegetables, mud, even human waste were thrown. In many towns, it was a form of communal participation encouraged by clergy and officials alike. This wasn't reserved for major crimes. Peasants were often punished for what the church categorized as moral failures: blasphemy, adultery, missing mass, speaking against a priest, or even minor theft. Crimes committed by the poor were treated as moral shortcomings, but similar offenses by nobility often escaped the same public condemnation. The punishment, though religious in tone, was political in structure. It reinforced a hierarchy. The message was blunt: defy authority, and your shame becomes a lesson for others. Women, too, were frequent targets, especially those labeled as scolds, gossips, or suspected of immorality. The pillory became a tool not only for enforcing religious norms, but for reinforcing social roles. A woman accused of challenging a husband's authority or disrupting the community's sense of order might find herself immobilized in a public square, silenced not just physically but socially. Over time, the church's role in these practices was not merely spiritual endorsement, it was administrative. Church courts, especially in England and France, issued sentences for moral offenses under canon law, and public shaming served as both punishment and warning. While physical torture was reserved for higher crimes, humiliation was efficient, public, and symbolic. By the 17th century, critics began to question its value. But for centuries before that, the stocks and pillories stood as silent sentinels of a society where punishment meant performance, where pain was public, and where shame was treated as salvation. By the 13th century, physical punishment wasn't only a method of control, it was a form of devotion. In cities like Rome, Cologne, and Avignon, public flagellation was carried out not just as a sentence, but as a spectacle of faith. The church had helped cement an idea that suffering could purify the soul, that panif endured for the right. Reasons was a path to redemption, and it wasn't just criminals who bled in the streets. It was believers. The practice had roots in early Christian asceticism, but became widespread during periods of crisis. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, the streets filled with men marching barefoot, stripped to the waist, flogging themselves in synchronized rhythm. These were the flagellant Soleil movement that exploded across Germany, the Low Countries, and northern Italy. Their message was simple: society's sins had brought divine wrath, and only extreme penance could earn mercy. The church at first tolerated them, seeing their self-punishment as sincere, but soon turned against the movement. By 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellants as heretical. Their growing popularity and independent preaching threatened church authority. Still, the idea endured that pain, if chosen or endured for moral failure, had spiritual value. Forced flagellation, on the other hand, was more bureaucratic. Church courts routinely sentenced the accused, especially peasants, laborers, and women, to public whipping. Whether for fornication, gossip, missing mass, or speaking against a priest, the punishment was carried out under religious supervision. In England and France, this was often done at the doors of the church after Sunday service. In full view of the congregation, for the lower classes, public whipping was not just physical suffering. It was a reminder that their bodies were not entirely their own. They belonged to a structure that viewed discipline as salvation. Priests would read prayers aloud during the punishment. In some cases, Victims were made to recite confessions as the lash fell. The rope or leather whip left welts, sometimes scars, and always a message. Salvation was painful. Obedience was visible. Women faced this punishment disproportionately for offenses tied to sexuality or speech. In some regions, convicted prostitutes were whipped through the streets before being expelled from town. The act was meant to cleanse the community as much as the individual. Flagellation, whether self-imposed or enforced, became a ritual that blurred the line between worship and punishment. It was never just about the crime. It was about conformity, public obedience, and turning suffering into a public affirmation of faith. The heretic's fork was a simple device. Two metal prongs facing opposite directions, fastened between the chin and the chest, or between the chin and the sternum and the base of the throat. A metal strap around the neck held it in place. The victim couldn't speak, couldn't lower their head, couldn't sleep without risk of impalement. Movement meant pain. Silence became a prison. Used primarily by inquisitorial courts in the 13th to 16th centuries, the fork wasn't meant to kill. Its purpose was control of voice, of mind, of will. It was part of a broader system built to suppress dissent at its root. Thought that, in the eyes of the medieval church, heresy wasn't just a crime, it was contagion. A dangerous idea could spread faster than rebellion. And so the Inquisition didn't just hunt those who acted against the church. It hunted those who believed differently. The Dominicans, who led inquisitorial efforts in places like France, Spain, and Italy, were trained not only to detect doctrinal error, but to extract confessions through psychological and physical pressure. The fork was often used after a confession had been forced when the accused was released but not trusted. It ensured silence. It prevented relapse. It marked the wearer as both guilty and watched. In some cases, a short phrase was inscribed on the metal: "I recant" or "I deny." A reminder, hanging from the neck, that faith had been broken and restored under duress. While less well-known than devices like the rack or the strappado, the heretic's fork reveals how the church responded to resistance, not just with violence, but with surveillance. Its message was clear: even thinking the wrong thing warranted pain. Those targeted were rarely nobles. It was the commoner, the minor scholar, the rural preacher. Inquisitors kept detailed records. In Toulouse, in the early 14th century, court transcripts showed dozens accused of unauthorized preaching, owning forbidden texts, or simply expressing doubt. They weren't always executed, but they were corrected visibly, painfully. In a society where scripture was read aloud, where priests mediated access to divine truth, speaking against doctrine was revolutionary. The fork made sure that revolution never found a voice in the records of European witch trials between the 15th and 17th centuries. One device appears with disturbing frequency: iron footwear, designed not for walking, but for suffering, known by various names: Sion shoes, Spanish boots, or simply heated boots. These instruments were used not in the public square, but behind closed doors. Their purpose was clear: extract confession, punish defiance, and send a message few would forget. The iron shoes were crude, yet deliberate. A pair of metal casings, often resembling open-toed sandals or full boots, were locked around the lower legs and feet. Once secured, hot coals or boiling oil were applied underneath or poured inside. In other cases, the entire boot was heated over fire while clamped to the victim's legs. Flesh burned slowly, toes blackened, and bones cracked. Under thermal pressure, the pain was excruciating, prolonged. and intentionally irreversible. These tortures were most frequently used during witch trials, particularly in regions like Spain, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. The Spanish Inquisitionist, under figures like Tomás de Torquemada in the late 15th century, authorized various methods to compel testimony from accused heretics and witches. Heated boots were not as widely known as the rack or strappado, but their psychological value was significant. Victims knew that even a single accusation, however flimsy, could lead to suffering without trial in the modern sense. In Bamberg and Würzburg, during the height of the German witch hunts in the early 1600s, trial records show the use of such punishments on those accused of sorcery, consorting with the devil, or possessing forbidden knowledge. Most were women. Many were elderly. The accusation alone was often enough to authorize torture. The boots, like other devices, were not meant to kill but to ensure cooperation. Confession was the goal, one that conveniently justified both punishment and execution. Blasphemy, too, could bring similar punishment. A peasant who questioned a priest publicly, or who refused to recant unorthodox beliefs, might be subjected to torture meant to both silence and terrify. The boots left survivors permanently crippled, unable to walk, work, or participate in daily life. Their injuries became living proof of divine justice, as framed by church authority, though not universally applied, and more often associated with secular or inquisitorial courts than parish churches. The use of iron footwear underlines a chilling fact. When religion fused with fear, punishment extended far beyond the soul. It left marks on flesh visible, permanent, and inescapable in 17th century England. Drunkenness wasn't just a vice, it was a public offense, and the punishment wasn't designed for silence or seclusion. It was designed for display. Among the more humiliating methods was the drunkard's cloak, a barrel with holes cut out for the arms and head. Offenders were forced to wear it like a grotesque costume and parade through the streets, watched, laughed at, and often pelted with refuse. This form of punishment emerged during a time of growing Puritan influence, particularly after the English Reformation. While the Church of England officially broke from Rome in the 1530s under Henry VIII, religious control didn't diminish, it shifted. Parish authorities, local constables, and church wardens were tasked with maintaining moral discipline. That meant monitoring behavior not just inside the church, but in taverns, markets, and homes. The drunkard's cloak was more than a device. It was public theater. Its purpose wasn't only to shame the individual, but to warn the community. Church courts, known as ecclesiastical courts, were deeply involved in enforcing these social norms. Minor moral failings, like swearing, skipping church, or drinking to excess, were treated as threats to communal order. Repeat offenders might be whipped or fined, but those caught drunk in public could be fitted with the cloak and led from village to village. Records from County Durham and York in the mid-1600s show several cases where men and occasionally women were punished this way. The choice of a barrel wasn't accidental. It exaggerated the sin, turning the individual into a walking caricature of excess. The spectacle was the point. The community became the audience, and the message was clear. Deviance would not be hidden. This approach blurred the lines between law, religion, and humiliation. The church didn't just guide souls, it helped enforce a culture of surveillance. Morality wasn't private, it was judged, displayed, and punished in full view. By the late medieval period, fire was not just a method of execution, it was doctrine. Burning at the stake became the official punishment for heresy and witchcraft in many parts of Europe, authorized by church and state alike. The flames were not meant only to destroy the body. They were meant to purify the soul, or so the authorities claimed. In truth, it was often a public warning disguised as religious duty. The procedure was highly ritualized. Once condemned, the accused, usually by an ecclesiastical court, was handed over to secular authorities for execution. This legal fiction allowed the church to avoid direct responsibility for the death sentence, though it had orchestrated every part of the trial. Inquisitors, particularly during the Spanish Inquisition, insisted that heretics were offered chances to repent. Those who confessed might be spared the flames and executed by other means. But those who held to their beliefs, Cathars in London, Lollards in England, or Protestant dissenters during the Reformation, were marched to the stake. The burning was staged deliberately. In places like Smithfield in London, or the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, it drew crowds from surrounding towns. Children were brought. Priests gave sermons. Public prayers were offered. In some regions, the execution was timed to coincide with religious festivals or holy days. This was no accident. The goal was to imprint fear alongside faith, which trials escalated the use of fire. In Germany, between 1580 and 1630, entire communities were swept into mass executions. Towns like Würzburg and Bamberg became infamous for their large-scale witch burnings. The accused were often women midwives, widows, or simply outsiders arrested on vague charges, tortured until confession, then condemned to death. In these trials, the fire was said to cleanse the devil's mark, to prevent the spirit from returning, and to deter others from consorting with evil. But beneath the theological justifications lay a more calculated motive: control. Burning at the stake was a public demonstration of power. It served to reaffirm church authority, suppress alternative beliefs, and remind the population that deviance would be met with destruction, not in secrecy, but in the open, for all to witness. The people who gathered weren't just observers, they were participants, encouraged to shout prayers, sing hymns, or join in condemnation. They became part of the machinery of fear. Over time, these rituals lost none of their violence, but the meanings shifted. What began as spiritual correction evolved into political repression. By the 18th century, the practice began to decline in Western Europe, challenged by Enlightenment ideals and increasing skepticism toward religious violence. But for centuries prior, the stake stood as one of the most feared instruments of public order, wrapped in scripture, enforced by law, and lit by fire in medieval Europe. Justice was not simply a matter of evidence or testimony, was believed to be an expression of divine will. For those accused of theft, blasphemy, adultery, or heresy, guilt was often determined not by facts, but by survival. Trial by ordeal was the process, and God was considered the final judge. The ordeal of boiling water was one of the most common methods. The accused would plunge their hand into a cauldron of boiling liquid to retrieve a stone or ring placed at the bottom. The hand was then bound and inspected after 3 days. If it showed signs of healing, the person was deemed innocent. If it festered, guilt was assumed. In some cases, even touching the container itself could suffice depending on the judgment of the clergy present. Another method was the ordeal by fire. This involved carrying a red-hot iron bar over a set distance, often 9 feet, while barefoot. Like the boiling water test, the condition of the burn after several days was said to reveal the truth. The church claimed that God would protect the innocent from harm. In reality, it was a combination of superstition, fear, and an absolute faith in divine intervention, often manipulated by those in power. Drowning ordeals were applied more frequently during witch trials, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries. In these cases, the accused were bound and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it was believed the water, considered a pure element, had rejected them, proving their guilt. If they sank, innocence was confirmed, though often too late to matter. This practice appeared in regions like England and the German states, fueled by hysteria and reinforced by church-backed doctrine. While some ordeals had roots in pre-Christian customs, the church institutionalized them. By the 9th and 10th centuries, priests regularly officiated the rituals, invoking blessings and prayers before the act. Canon law courts, especially in the Frankish kingdoms and Anglo-Saxon England, relied on such ordeals to resolve disputes where no witnesses were available or where a confession was lacking. But the consequences were brutal. The psychological terror was as devastating as the physical harm. Accused individuals often went into these ordeals knowing that survival was unlikely or irrelevant. The community would watch. Clergy would oversee, and the outcome, no matter how arbitrary, was rarely questioned. It wasn't until the early 13th century that the tide began to shift. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council under Pope Innocent III banned clergy from participating in ordeals. Gradually, the practice declined in much of Europe, replaced by more structured inquisitorial systems. But for centuries, the idea that pain could reveal truth shaped lives, destroyed reputations, and left the concept of justice tangled with fear, ritual, and the illusion of divine certainty. The Branks, commonly known as the Scolds, Brightlefirst, appeared in Scotland in the 16th century and quickly spread to England and parts of continental Europe. It was a metal cage, fitted tightly around the head, with an iron plate inserted into the mouth. That plate, often sharpened or spiked, pressed against the tongue, making speech nearly impossible. Any attempt to talk caused pain. In some designs, even slight movement triggered injury. This punishment was almost exclusively reserved for women. Official records referred to them as scolds, a vague label applied to those who were outspoken, gossiped, argued in public, or challenged male authority. The crime was not criminal in the modern sense. It was social. The Branks served one purpose: to punish and prevent speech that disrupted patriarchal order. Though not created directly by the church, the punishment was often administered or endorsed by church, courts, and clergy, especially in Protestant regions where ecclesiastical authorities were empowered to enforce moral discipline. In many cases, it was the church that defined what behavior was disorderly or unwise. Women accused of arguing with their husbands, speaking harshly in public, or criticizing a local minister could be sentenced to wear the branks. The public nature of the punishment added to its function. Women were often led through town wearing the device chained at the neck, while crowds watched or followed. In some parishes, the bridle was permanently displayed on church walls or in town halls, an ever-present warning. Silence was enforced not just by steel, but by fear. The branks were part of a larger system of gendered control. Church doctrine reinforced the idea that a woman's virtue was tied to obedience, modesty, and silence. The Apostle Paul's instruction that women should remain quiet in church was often cited. Punishments like the branks turned these beliefs into law. By the 18th century, the use of the branks declined, criticized as barbaric. But for centuries, it remained a tool that merged religious authority, local governance, and patriarchal control into one visible and painful restraint. Excommunication was not a physical punishment. It left no scars, spilled no blood, and required no instruments of torture. But in the world of medieval Europe, it was often more feared than the lash or the noose. To be excommunicated by the Church was to be cut off, not only from the sacraments, but from society itself. The practice had deep roots, formalized as early as the 4th century. By the 11th and 12th centuries, under the growing influence of the papacy, excommunication became a central tool for enforcing obedience, spiritual, political, and social. It could be used against heretics, rulers, rebellious priests, or common people who defied church authority. The punishment removed access to communion, confession, marriage, burial in consecrated ground, all of which were considered essential to salvation. But the consequences reached far beyond the spiritual. In tightly knit rural communities, where nearly every aspect of life revolved around the church calendar and ritual, excommunication meant isolation. Neighbors were forbidden to speak to the condemned. No one could trade with them, host them, or share a meal. Even family members were pressured to sever ties. Excommunication became a form of social death. One of the most notable cases occurred in 1076, when Pope Gregory VII excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV during the investiture controversy. Henry had attempted to appoint bishops without papal approval. The excommunication shattered his political authority, leading to rebellion among the German princes. In 1077, Henry was forced to travel across the Alps in winter and wait barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside Canossa Castle, begging for absolution. The event became symbolic of the Church's power not just over faith, but over kings. In smaller villages, the effects could be just as devastating. A peasant accused of blasphemy, failing to pay tithes, or defying a priest might be excommunicated by the local bishop. Though appeals were technically possible, most lacked the means to challenge the sentence. Without access to community life or religious rites, many were forced to confess publicly, perform penance, or leave the area altogether. While some forms of excommunication were temporary and conditional, others were permanent. Over time, the Church developed formal procedures, including greater and lesser excommunications, degrees of severity, and lists of offenses. But the underlying purpose remained the same: control. It ensured obedience, not through pain, but through fear of isolation, damnation, and the loss of identity in a world where the Church defined what it meant to be human. Excommunication functioned as an invisible wall. No chains were needed. Belief and the authority behind it did the rest. In medieval and early modern Europe, discipline was not just a matter of family or school, it was a matter of salvation. The Church taught that human nature was inherently sinful, even from birth, and that correction, physical, visible correction, was a duty shared by both parents and clergy. Within this worldview, beating a child was not an act of cruelty. It was a moral obligation. Tithing rods were a common instrument. These thin, flexible sticks were used in churches, schools, and homes, particularly in Protestant regions like England and Germany. In some parishes, tithing men lay officials appointed to help enforce moral order carried the rods during services. If a child whispered, fidgeted, or failed to kneel properly, the rod was used to strike the shoulders or legs. The message was simple: discipline begins with fear of God. In church-run schools, corporal punishment was routine. Latin primers and psalters were memorized under the threat of the birch. Mispronouncing a verse or forgetting a catechism answer could bring swift consequences. Teachers often cited biblical passages to justify the beatings. Proverbs 13:24, "He who spares the rod hates his son," was used as a theological foundation. The idea was not just to enforce obedience, but to shape the soul. This doctrine of discipline extended into homes, confessional manuals, and sermons. Instructed parents to use physical punishment to correct sin before it could take root. Even toddlers could be struck for perceived disobedience. Manuals circulated among clergy and literate households, outlining the age-appropriate use of punishment, emphasizing moderation, but never discouraging the rod in some areas. Particularly in Puritan communities, discipline took on a near-liturgical character. Beatings were administered after prayer and framed as acts of love, not anger. The pain was meant to purge pride, correct rebellion, and instill humility. Resistance or complaint was treated as defiance, not just of parents, but of divine order. The church's role was not limited to teaching these values, reinforced them through institutions, parish, schools, confirmation classes, and confessions, all operated within a culture where physical discipline was normalized and sanctified. The child was seen as a moral battleground. The rod, a tool of correction as well as control. Over time, especially by the 18th and 19th centuries, attitudes toward childhood and punishment began to shift. But for centuries prior, the idea that pain could produce virtue remained central to both religious instruction and everyday life. In the eyes of the Church, to beat a child was not to harm it, was to save. The Iron Virgin, more commonly known as the Iron Maiden, is one of the most infamous torture devices in European law. A tall, human-shaped metal cabinet lined with interior spikes, it was said to pierce the flesh of anyone locked inside, slowly bleeding them to death while keeping them upright and conscious. The device is often presented as a tool of medieval church justice. But historical evidence tells a more complicated story. No verified accounts from the Middle Ages describe the use of the Iron Maiden as a real, functioning instrument of torture. The most famous example, housed in Nuremberg and often cited as authentic, is now widely believed to have been a 19th century fabrication assembled from older parts to fit a narrative that had already taken hold in the popular imagination. Its construction coincided with a growing interest in medieval punishment as a form of macabre spectacle, not with historical accuracy. The myth, however, was powerful. By the time European museums began displaying torture exhibits in the 18th and 19th centuries, the image of cruel devices, especially ones tied to religions, served both curiosity and propaganda. Enlightenment critics of the Church often included the Iron Maiden in lists of brutal Catholic punishments. Protestant nations used these tales to cast the Catholic Church as backward and barbaric. In reality, while the Church did sanction many forms of real torture from the rack to the strappado, it did not record the use of spike-lined coffins as legal or ecclesiastical instruments. But the fear these images inspired was real. Even if never used, the idea of such devices contributed to a cultural atmosphere where obedience was reinforced by imagined suffering. The line between reality and rumor was easily blurred, especially when official justice was already harsh, and most peasants lacked the means to question what they were told. Word-of-mouth warnings, public sermons, and local folklore turned exaggerated accounts into perceived fact. This phenomenon wasn't limited to the Iron Maiden. Similar stories surrounded devices like the pear of anguish, the Judas cradle, and other implements whose historical usage remains debated. Some were real but rare. Others were inventions, later given legitimacy by museums or traveling exhibitions. What matters is how these stories functioned. They helped shape public understanding of power. The fear of what might happen often ensured compliance more effectively than the punishment itself. In many cases, obedience was secured not by actual pain, but by the imagined horrors whispered between villagers or passed down in warnings from pulpit to pew. By the 14th century, Europe's peasantry lived under overlapping systems of control. Feudal lords demanded labor and taxes. The church demanded obedience, tithes, and submission of the soul. Between the two, little space remained for dissent. And yet, what's most striking is not the scale of resistance, but the silence. Generations of peasants witnessed public punishments, whippings in front of church doors, neighbors in stocks, women in branks, men burned as heretics. The message was consistent. Questioning authority, whether noble or divine, invited pain. And in most cases, the church didn't just endorse the punishments it administered or justified them. Religious doctrine reinforced this submission. Suffering was framed as part of God's plan. Poverty was interpreted as divine will. To rebel wasn't just to disobey, it was to sin. Sermons warned against pride, heresy, and even curiosity. Salvation came through humility, not confrontation. Confession, not rebellion. The fear of eternal damnation, along with the very real fear of corporal punishment, kept many in line. Illiteracy deepened the divide. Most peasants had no access to scripture, law, or outside ideas beyond what clergy told them. The Bible, written in Latin, was interpreted exclusively by priests. The church was not just a religious authority, it was the source of moral truth, community leadership, and often legal judgment. Poverty played its part as well. Starvation, disease, and seasonal hardship kept daily survival at the forefront. Organizing resistance required time, communication, and risk, luxuries few could afford. In places where revolts did occur, like the English peasants' revolt of 1381, the response was swift and brutal. Leaders were hunted, executed, and publicly displayed. These consequences echoed through villages long after the uprisings were suppressed. This wasn't passive ignorance. It was learned restraint. Centuries of watching neighbors punished, family members humiliated, and heretics burned created a cultural memory of caution. Even whispers of doubt could be dangerous. In such a world, silence wasn't just fear, it was survival. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, religious punishment served a dual purpose: correction and control. Officially, the church claimed these axe whippings, burnings, humiliations were to save souls. But when stripped of their theological framing, they reveal something more systemic, an effort to secure obedience through fear. Power was embedded in ritual. A burning at the stake was framed as purification, not execution. A child's beating with a tithing rod became parental virtue. A woman silenced by a brank was said to be morally restored. In each case, violence was redefined as mercy and enforced by the institutions meant to offer grace. This structure relied on the blurring of morality with authority. Questioning the priest meant questioning God. Dissent became heresy. Disobedience became sin. Punishment followed not because of justice in the modern sense, but because stability required it. And stability, in a world ruled by fragile hierarchies, was treated as sacred. What's most revealing is how often these punishments targeted the poor, the uneducated, the powerless. Heretics were rarely kings. Witches were rarely men. Public humiliation and brutal correction were imposed on those with the least ability to resist. This was not a coincidence, it was design. The Church was not alone in this. Civil authorities often cooperated, sharing responsibility for enforcement. But what made religious punishment unique was its reach into conscience. These weren't just violations of law. They were violations of faith, dealt with by institutions claiming divine mandate. Centuries later, the symbols have faded, but the questions remain. When does faith become submission? How easily can moral guidance become coercion? And at what point does silence in the name of order replace the conscience it was meant to protect? These punishments were never just about sin. They were about who had the right to define it and what they were willing to do to enforce that right. For centuries, the Church shaped not just belief, but behavior. It dictated what was holy, what was sinful, and what was punishable. It stood as both judge and guide, offering forgiveness with one hand and wielding pain with the other. Public whippings, burnings, forced silence, and social exile were all carried out not as cruelty, but as correction. And because they were framed as spiritual acts, they were rarely questioned. To the people who lived under its authority, submission became routine, not because they agreed, but because resistance meant isolation, suffering, or death. In time, pain became familiar. Not just physical pain, but the mental weight of obedience, of guilt, of being watched, not just by neighbors, but by a God whose laws were spoken through men in robes. What makes this legacy so unsettling is not just what happened, but how it was justified. Violence was transformed into virtue. Silence was repackaged as humility. Entire generations were taught to see suffering as necessary for salvation. And for many, the line between faith and fear was never clear. It didn't need to be. This wasn't only about doctrine. It was about power, about controlling how people thought, what they said, what they feared, and what they never dared to question. And while the medieval Church no longer holds the same reach, the model it established of obedience enforced through sacred authority did not vanish with time. The real cost wasn't only the lives lost or the bodies broken, it was the silence that followed, the internalization of control, the learned habit of submission. The question remains, how many of those who obeyed believed, and how many simply couldn't afford not to? And beneath it all, one question endures. How much of what was called piety was simply fear in disguise?